We have with us Professor Manish Thakur. He is a professor in public policy and management in the Indian Institute of Management, IIM Kolkata. He is the recipient of Professor VKRV Rao Award in Social Sciences, Sociology in 2014, and the Indian Sociological Society's Professor M.N. Srinivas Memorial Award for Young Sociologists in 2017. His most recent books are Management Education in India, Perspectives and Practices, co-edited with R. Rajesh Babu, published by Springer in 2017, and Doing Theory, Locations, Hierarchies, Disjunctions, co-edited with Professor Maitri Chaudhary, published by Orient Black Swan in 2018. Sir, we are very happy and grateful to have you on Doing Sociology. Welcome to this interview.
Thank you.
To begin, we have a very basic and primary sounding question for you. Since you teach sociology in IIM Calcutta, can you talk about your experience of teaching a discipline like sociology in a management institute?
I'm happy that you asked me this question. Just to give you a sense of the context, before I came to this Institute of Management, that is IIM Calcutta, I had taught for almost a decade in a university. I was teaching in Goa University prior to joining IIM Calcutta. So in that sense, I have experience in teaching in a university. And then I think I'm in a situation when I can compare my experience of being a university teacher to that of a teacher in a management institute. So primarily, I see that in a university, you don't have to justify all the time that why are you teaching a subject that you are teaching. No one would ask you, why are you not teaching biotechnology or computer sciences? You are teaching what you are teaching. So in that sense, the way the idea of university has historically unfolded, there is a place for all sorts of disciplines, all kinds of disciplines. I'm not saying that in the university there is no hierarchy of disciplines. Of course, we have hierarchy of disciplines, like science subjects are considered in many places, maybe JNU could be an exception, much higher in the rank order than many other subjects in humanities or social sciences. But in a management institute, I feel that, pressure of justifying all the time to everyone who is around me that why am I here? What is my mandate? Rather, what is my legitimacy to be there in an institute of management? So someone, to illustrate, who is teaching marketing or someone who is teaching finance. So my colleagues in these disciplines, they don't have to confront this question that why are they there in an institute of management, but I have to carry this question with me inside the classroom or outside the classroom in meetings, academic council meetings, in the classroom. So many of them who join, they also think that sociology as a discipline is some sort of an add-on. So they don't look at, though we keep talking about things like we are a perspective, we do perspective building, we belong to a critical discipline. So all these good things that you can claim and get away with in a university, here you have to, I would say that keep convincing your significant other on an everyday basis. So this is the main difference that I see in teaching in a university or teaching in a management institute. I hope I have brought some clarity to your question. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, sir, for that answer. Now, my question to you is that, how does the lens of disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity become a meaningful perspective to make sense of the historically evolving interaction between sociology and management education?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think I have written a book which is yet to be published. It's lying with the publishing house, and I hope to see it in print by the end of this month. So where I have investigated this relationship that you have asked me between sociology and management education as the relationship has historically evolved. And what I see is that there are contextual differences. So in the US, in the beginning, of course, we had much proximate relationship between the two. But then later, and I want to make use of this expression that later, as management had this pressure to evolve into an independent academic discipline, so it started severing its bonds with the larger gamut of other academic disciplines, including social science disciplines. So it had its own disciplines like international business, or it had disciplines like marketing or finance. So this, I call it the pressure of distinctiveness. So as management went through this protocol of establishing itself as a scientific academic disciplines, somehow it had to carve out its own subject matter, which would look distinct compared to other academic disciplines, which had a much longer history. So I see that that relationship is now getting, in a way, much thinner as with the passage of time. But again, to give you an illustration, it has not always been the case. Like in IIM Calcutta, and I want to put it on record that IIM Calcutta is the only institute of management where we had an independent department of sociology. We call it an academic group, but now it's no longer there. That's why you would have seen my affiliation is to public policy and management and not to that discipline. Because our role model in 1961, when the institute was established, was MIT in the US. And there, since the focus was more on fundamental disciplines, academic disciplines, so IIM Calcutta followed that model. So we had more focus on fundamental academic disciplines. But much later, as the US has become the reference model for everything and anything we do in the global South, including India, I think that relationship has got emptied of its historical content. And that's the complaint that some of us who come from other disciplines have against management education, that they do not want to converse with us the way even some of the earlier generation of management educators, they wanted to converse with the larger gamut of academic disciplines.
Right, sir. Thank you for that answer again. My next question is again connected to this. In your book, Sociology in Management Education, you have argued that histories of both sociology and management studies have been characterized by a certain shared desire to gain a scientific status. So if you could throw some light on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. At Cambridge in 1960s, there was an attempt to include management on par with other established disciplines in Cambridge University. The idea was that if management gets included at the university level, it will be able to enhance its prestige, so to say. But at that point of time, this attempt was not successful. Why? Because many of the Cambridge dons, they said that, look, management is not a discipline in proper sense of the term. It's an applied discipline. So what you should do is that you should be teaching management in a polytechnic institute or all those places where some of these applied disciplines are being taught or being offered and all. But look at the way the cycle has come full circle. Now, so at that point of time, just I am talking of half a century back, it was management which was trying in all possible ways to prove its scientific credentials as a discipline, and other disciplines were on a much, much higher rungs of the ladder. But now, given the popularity that management has acquired, and now everyone wants to or appears to go for management. So now the market, if I can call a market or the societal common sense even, has given so much of so much of glamour, has imparted so much of glamour to management that even academic institutions are just catering to that given sense of glamour. And that's why it's management now as a discipline which is dictating the terms rather than the other way around, which I gave you the illustration of Cambridge. Even in the US, Before 1950s, management was part of what they call the different types of professional institutions, and they had tough time making their entry in the university system. Even when they were in the university system, they were in a way looked down upon. But I think today no one would believe, and more so management educators would never believe that half a century back they had to go through such processes of acquiring scientific status. Yeah.
Right. So when we talk about IIMs, the issue of reservations in both faculty positions as well as doctoral programs have also been in the limelight, particularly even in the news for years. So how can one understand this issue, sociologically? What would be your comments on it?
Yeah. Since you brought in sociologically, so sociologically, let's be very candid. IIMs as institutions are largely engaged in reproducing inequality. If you can recall your Pierre Bourdieu and all those sociologists of education, so they are engaged in this business of producing elites. But who are the new elites that they are producing? Largely the ones who had all sorts of capital, economic, cultural, and social capital to be in such institutions in the first place. And then you get these credentials of management degree by way of management degree. And with the help of these credentials, and as you know, credentials are differentially assessed, evaluated in the job market. So the credentials that you get from an IIM, they help you perpetuate your elite status. And generally you have this combination of IIT and IIM. And in India, if you have the credentials first from IIT, and then combine it with IIM, any IIM, and then you are on the seventh heaven and things like that. So that's the first thing. But however, having said that, as we had some of the affirmative action programs, so at least in one degree, that is the MBA, what we call Masters in Business Administration, we had the usual quota of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and much later, as you know, we had OBC. So largely reproducing elites, but giving some leeway to young men and women from these categories that they can also partake of these credentials. So that has been one case. So where MBA had affirmative action since the very beginning, and they have been going by the government guidelines. However, till 3 or 4 years back, we never had any quota in our doctoral program. No quota in doctoral program. So just 3-4 years back, we have introduced quota in doctoral program, but then we have brought down the numbers. So in IIM, in 1 year, you just take 20 PhD candidates. So out of 20, 10 for general and 10 for the other categories. So for maybe in over last 3-4 years, we may have added just 30 or so doctoral candidates. So you can see the difference. So let's say like JNU or DU, where you already had this quota. So this quota is much of a latecomer in faculty. And I want to go public on this. In faculty, I am somehow had managed for last 55-60 years not to implement any quota in appointments. In fact, I had written a short piece in EPW with one of my colleagues about this, IIMs and the job quota in faculty appointment. So we have, maybe if my calculation is correct, we have maybe one person who belongs to any of these categories, SC, ST, and OBC, as of now, out of some 70 or 80 faculty members that we have. So you can see the imbalance, so to say. But the good news is that now I learned that government has issued a very categorical and unambiguous guideline, and IIMs have been asked to implement quota in terms of faculty appointment, and the institute is working towards that. So maybe in another 5 or 10 years time, we will have more diverse faculty group. But then again, the underlying premise is that unless ideologically you are for quota, you can always delay its implementation. by always invoking that, oh, we are not getting good quality candidates among the categories. We should not compromise with excellence. Some of the key terms that they are very fond of using: excellence, eminence, etc., etc. And that has happened in other institutions as well. So you can see that even now, there are plenty of domains, institutional domains in this country where after so many years after independence, we have not been able to fill up the quota that we have. So, but it's late, but they are now working towards that. So I see it's a movement in the right direction.
So in this context, what is the role of different social science disciplines, say, such as sociology? How do they contribute to policy making?
See, in the larger context, like in the university and all, a discipline like ours can contribute by making us equipped to critically engage with some of these contentious issues. So the idea is that we can bring to bear disciplinary resources to understand the need for quota, the idea of equity, how justice has to be, allied with some of our constitutional or democratic goals. So some of these larger debates around the idea of dignity, the idea of justice, the idea of fair distribution, or idea of non-discrimination. So in order to grasp some of the nuances of some of these key terms, which all of us have inherited in modern times, the critical disciplines give us the resources, the intellectual resources to engage with. And in that sense, it may not lead to a very concrete sort of policy recommendations, but then again, the legitimacy of why we have quota. I'm just giving one illustration. This legitimacy would be well established, that ideological legitimacy, that why a country like India should have quota for women, quota for other marginalized groups and communities. So that way, critical disciplines help. In IIMs or the institutions like IIMs, policy making, at least in my reading, gets reduced to some of the consultancy projects that you do. Let's say impact assessment of some plan in the Northeast, or something related to some ministry. So here it's more nuts and bolts sort of recommendations without delving deep into the larger ideological political context. So the politics becomes a dirty word. Just try to see that. In a university, if you are political, apparently political, it means that you have a much larger understanding of the processes that you are part of, or the processes which have a bearing on your life chances. But in an IIM, if you are political, it means it becomes a sign of your, lack of fit with the institution. You should not ideally be political. And if you continue to be political, it means somehow you have failed in getting institutionally socialized in a proper fashion or in a proper way. So this is that's where I see the contributions, the critical contributions, the critical thinking that social science disciplines in general bring to the classroom or the institutional framework. And here it's more like applied in orientation. They will only say, oh, in what sense you are relevant to the market. And relevance also becomes a much narrower concept. Your relevance becomes relevance to the maybe the economic domain or the corporate sector. Relevance gets reduced in that sense. And relevance is, not to the larger, older idea of nation building. I don't know how many of you have heard of this term nation building. There was a time when in 1950s and 60s, and you all should investigate, this term was being used on an everyday basis. Now, no one makes use of this term nation building. And if I bring that term to my class, everyone will laugh and they would not recognize the term, what is nation building? You can see that. So as the country has changed, we have changed. There was a time when we had the notion of brain drain. You understand that? That we should not be going to US, UK, first serving our country. Our country has put in so much of resources in training us as engineers and managers. Now, as a country, we take pride that, we are sending our people to other countries, and diaspora has become a marker of our success, the successful diaspora. So as the context has changed, so the role of institutions like IIMs, and so the internal discourse within the institute itself has changed.
All right. So you've also written about the role of institutions like the National Institution of Rural Development. So how do you see the relationship between the state, then policymakers and social scientists with, keeping in mind these institutions?
Yes, that was one of my early works. In fact, that was part of my doctoral work, where I had looked at two institutions, NIRD in Hyderabad, or also another institute called IRMA, Institute of Rural Management in Anand in Gujarat. And to give you an essence of what I was going to, I had said then was that I had said that in NIRD, the writ of the ministry runs in its capillaries and veins. What I meant to say is that NIRD was like an extended branch of the Ministry of Rural Development and things like that. So you may have sociologists working there, you may have anthropologists and political scientists working there, but the way institute was conceived as part of, as an extended part of the ministry, they did not have much of critical autonomous room to give their own independent contributions. So they would largely endorse what ministry would expect them to do. So there, the disciplines don't matter. It's also, that's the point I'm trying to bring here, that it's not some ideal image of an academic discipline. It's what is the context where you are practicing that discipline. So some of you now are aware that practicing has become one of the most popular terms. So the practices of the discipline, and it's the practices of the discipline that will tell you whether you are being critical or you are just being, some sort of endorsers of the ruling classes or the ruling regime, or whatever is the, what you say, the regnant ideology of the day. So just having belonged to or having come from a critical discipline is not enough. We also have to see what are the institutional contexts where we all practice that discipline. That's how I would put it. And one anecdote from NIRD, if you allow me. So there I had been there. So on Thursday, they will give a Barak Khana. Barak Khana is grand dinner, Barak Khana. And that circular of the Barak Khana, that what would be the menu, whether you will have chicken or egg or paneer or mutton, everything had come printed from a ministry in New Delhi. So you can see that even the menu of that Barak Khana was decided by the ministry, and someone in Hyderabad was expected to follow that ministerial menu, in total. And that's what I mean, that they did not have much leeway, even if they had critical thinking, critical attitude to implement that or make use of their criticality in assessing policy or in contributing to policy making.
Right, sir. So our final question to you is that what has been the impact of development, particularly in rural areas, and what kind of transformation does it then lead to in the areas where such development schemes are carried out?
Sorry, I will, I think I may not be able to answer your question directly, because this is not the type of work that I have done. So I will take you to the type of work that I have done. And through you, I will try to put forth some of the arguments that I have been making for almost now past 2 decades. See, I don't look at what impact development has on the countryside. What I have looked at is that how the idea of this, whatever, program A or program B, plan A or plan B, that what some of these programs and plans have done is that they have changed the very idea of the village. What a village is ideologically, in terms ideationally. So the way we now look at the village is intimately linked to the impact that you talked about of these developmental programs. And here, I had borrowed from someone and I had argued that now in India of 21st century, because of n number of developmental programs, irrespective of their success or failure, what has happened is that the village has become some sort of governmentalized locality. I put it within inverted commas. That village, a modern Indian village, if you want to understand, you cannot understand an Indian village in our times without looking at that village as a governmentalized locality. And if you allow me, I will expand on it for 2 minutes. What I mean is that now the village as an entity is always defined by a sense of lack or a sense of absence. So what is a village? A village is a place which does not have infrastructure A, you don't have hospitals, you don't have facilities for quality education, you don't have a shopping mall, you may not have a nice beauty parlor, you may not manage to eat your ice cream even if you have money. So what these developmental programs have done is that they have defined village quintessentially as a place which is always, in the need of something from outside. And what is this something from outside? This something from outside is what we call development. So it's the development that has to come from outside, from Delhi, Lucknow, Patna, Bhubaneswar, and it's that which will make village the place to be, the ideal place. And till that happens, or till that happens successfully, a village remains defined in relation to this idea of absence or the idea of lack. That's how I look at the village. But this has also another consequence that even if the village remains, in a way embedded in this sense of perpetual sense of lack, there is some sort of aspirational revolution that we see all around the country. So you go to a village, they don't have a good educational institute, but you will see some board somewhere with English sounding names, St. Joseph, Little Tots, Mary Convent, this convent and that. And even poor want to send their children to such places and all. Everyone in the village these days, you would be shocked to know they are constructing, if they can afford, middle class flats with no provision for agricultural produce and things like that. So everyone wants to have a drawing room, and 2 bedrooms with attached toilets and things like that. So in terms of, and you have data, survey data, which shows that most of villagers, and most of them, if they get a chance, they would like to leave agriculture and they would like to join what we call the white collar jobs and all that. So there is, I put it this way, that not only that there is an agrarian crisis that everyone knows, but there is a definite sense of dystopia that we see in Indian village. So we have some sort of agrarian dystopia where everyone who can and who gets a chance would like to leave the village if he or she gets to leave the village. So villages have become, I borrow this from Jonathan Parry, the anthropologist, the villages in India, at least to me, and here I differ from many others, have become some sort of waiting rooms. You know the metaphor of the waiting room. You are in a waiting room on a railway platform and you are waiting for your train and you take the first train that takes you to your destination. So villages in India have metaphorically become some sort of waiting rooms and from where everyone wants to live. And that's why I have problems with the older type of anthropological gloss that Indian village was imparted. Where they would romanticize that, oh, village is a ritual cosmic universe. You love your banyan tree. The soil of a village differs from, village A differs from the soil of the village V. It's like if you read the work of Valentine Daniel, who had worked on a Tamil village and all that. So all these glamour and gloss that how villagers are defined by some sort of, different sort of bonds. So much we have done. I don't want to get into that in our literature. This communitarian ethos, everything having some sort of sacred value, the boundaries of the village having some sort of sacred content and all that. I think if ever Indian village was defined in ritual cosmic term, it has got disrupted. And that brings me to the question that you asked. And I see development as an ideology, as a practice, with all its ifs and buts, with all its limitations, as one of the major extraneous source of change that has helped break that ritual cosmic universe of the village. And in its place, now we have villages being there, but as waiting rooms. Just to clarify, I don't mean to say that villages will not be there. Of course, we will have villages empirically out there. Demographically, demographers will tell you, census will tell you that this, these many Indians are living in villages. 70%, 65% of Indian population belong to this category called village and all. So maybe spatially they are there, demographically they are there, but we would be misleading ourselves if we think that villages remain there in the same way that one Srinivas would have made us believe through his remembered village and all that. So that's the point I'm trying to make. I don't know whether I'm clear, but these were some of the ideas that I have been trying to articulate in different ways. And in a very simpler form, I have written about this last year. I don't know whether you got a chance. I would urge you, if you get time, to just Google my name and just try the Marching Millions to Nowhere Villages. It's a popular piece. I wrote it for mainstream. And there I have tried to say some of the things that I am trying to communicate now in a much more simpler language, since it was meant for a popular audience. So I wrote it that way. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. You've talked about some of the very interesting as well as very important issues in this interview, and because you've talked about disciplinary histories, you've talked about your own experience of teaching sociology in a management institute. I think this is, a very unique interview that we've done today, and I'm sure all our viewers who will listen to this interview will take a lot from it. And you've also touched upon some of the very important themes, which includes affirmative action and all the issues surrounding it, particularly in institutes like IIMs. So again, from the Doing Sociology team, sir, I would like to thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule to do this interview with us today.
Okay, thank you, and it was nice talking to you. And I enjoyed talking to you. I don't know whether I made any sense to you, but at least so far as I am concerned, it was nice talking to you all. And I should also congratulate you for this nice and great initiative that some of you are engaged in. And I see a purpose and much value in what you are doing. And now, since most of the things are online, so I'm sure your blog and the type of things you are putting up there would be of some help to some people in some part of the country. So all the best. And again, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.